Greg was a student at a music college in New Orleans. He had dreamed of becoming a pianist and performing on a big stage since he was a child. While his peers played football and baseball, Greg spent hours learning the basics of playing the piano. He was raised by his mother and grandmother, as his father left the family when Greg was only 5 years old. His parents divorced because his father became addicted to gambling and was always in debt. Greg's mother, Natalie, couldn't stand her husband's behavior of borrowing money from friends, acquaintances, and colleagues, and not paying them back. He lost all the money he borrowed, and creditors came to his family demanding payment. Since his father left the family, things started to improve for them. Natalie got a job as a lawyer's assistant and saved enough money to pay for her son's education at a good music college. Greg was very close to his mother. They went through a lot together. At first, things were very difficult for them, and sometimes they didn't even have anything to eat for dinner. But things got better with time. Greg always cherished his mother and grandmother, who raised him. He dreamed of showing the world to his mother. He thought that someday he would become a world-class pianist and take his mother on tours with him. However, because Greg grew up without a father, he developed a gentle character. He was shy, unsure of himself, and found it difficult to interact with people. Greg looked like an attractive young man on the outside. He was of average height and had regular facial features. Girls found him cute. His reserve and modesty made him stand out among all the other guys who were constantly trying to show off their advantages to others. The college was mainly attended by creative people. All the young men here were unique and had freedom of thought. If you looked at them from the outside, you could say that these guys looked and dressed strangely. But inside the educational institution, no one really paid attention to piercings, brightly colored hair, and unusual outfits. But among all the students, there was one girl who managed to stand out even among such unusual students. This girl's name was Elizabeth. She was extremely unsociable. Mostly the girl walked alone, even had her lunch in the local cafe at a separate table. She did not interact with any of the students. Greg, with his modesty and shyness, felt like the life of the party compared to her. The girl immediately caught the interest of the young man. Her silence gave her a sense of mystery. Greg felt like they had something in common. He felt an indescribable attraction to her. Elizabeth studied at the art faculty, and Greg saw her only at general lectures on the theory of art. The girl always sat in the farthest row and did not engage in conversation with anyone. With each lecture, Greg sat closer and closer to her. He was timid and lacked the courage to approach and get to know her like ordinary people do. She seemed unusual to him, and he sought a non-standard approach to her. Greg was always very well liked by his peers. Usually, people with his character become victims, but for some reason, everyone loved him. His classmates always invited him to parties. Girls showed him all sorts of attention, and teachers were kind to him. Greg set a record for the number of Valentine's Day cards received and became famous throughout the college. However, he always remained a reserved and modest guy, which is probably why people were drawn to him, because despite all his achievements, he remained a normal, kind guy. The students' attitude towards Elizabeth was completely opposite. To say that they didn't like her is an understatement. Greg, of course, didn't know everything. But as soon as his friends and classmates noticed that he was interested in Elizabeth, they immediately began to tell him unpleasant stories about her. Greg had a friend named Mike. He told Greg that Elizabeth came from a troubled family. Her father was a criminal who was in prison, and her mother had a very questionable past. The girls also didn't miss the chance to defame Elizabeth. They told stories about how someone saw her on the cemetery at night, performing strange rituals. Rumors circulated that she was involved in some sort of spiritual stuff. All of this not only didn't repel Greg, but even caused even more interest in Elizabeth. One time, leaving the club with his friends after midnight, Greg noticed Elizabeth in the distance. By that time, he was a little drunk, He and his friends had been drinking beer and playing Mafia all evening. Mike said goodbye to Greg and called a taxi. But Greg, in a good mood, decided to approach Elizabeth after all. He waited until all his friends dispersed so that no one would see him following Elizabeth. When all his friends had left, Greg followed the girl. It's strange that Elizabeth is alone at night in the city center, thought Greg. Elizabeth was wearing a long black coat, under which striped long black and white socks were visible. She walked very fast, and Greg had to quicken his pace and even run some distance to catch up with her. He followed her, but couldn't bring himself to approach her. The girl never turned around and walked through crowds of people without looking up. Elizabeth crossed the road twice on a red light without even looking around. Greg followed her and tried not to fall behind. The night chill gradually sobered Greg up, and his courage waned with each passing minute. At one point, he already wanted to turn around and leave, but at the same moment, he noticed that a black book fell out of Elizabeth's backpack and fell to the sidewalk. The girl didn't even notice and continued to walk briskly. The young man immediately picked up the book and saw the inscription, The Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri. Greg had heard of Dante but had never read him. While he was examining the book, the girl vanished into the crowd. Greg looked around the entire street, even calling out her name a couple of times, but Elizabeth disappeared in an instant like a mirage. Greg wanted to call Elizabeth to meet her and give her the book, but he didn't have her number. None of Greg's acquaintances had her number. Or maybe they didn't want to give it to him, fearing that he would get closer to her. He would have gone to her house that same night if he only knew where she lived. Greg held a book in his hands, and for some reason, his heart was warm. Deep down, the thought that he was holding his beloved's personal possession delighted him. Yes, his beloved, because now he clearly understood that he was in love with Elizabeth. Greg went back home, lay on his bed, and read Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy all night. The book impressed him greatly. By the time he had to go to college, he had finished the first part where Dante and Virgil travel through hell. Arriving at college, he searched for Elizabeth during breaks between classes, but he couldn't find her all day. The girl had neither friends nor acquaintances. Nobody knew her phone number or where she lived. Only after the end of the school day, Greg was able to find a girl who occasionally corresponded with Elizabeth, and only because they worked on a project together. Greg asked her to tell Elizabeth that he had found her book and would like to return it to her. The girl suggested that Greg give her the book, and she would pass it on to Elizabeth when they meet. But the boy refused. He said that he really liked the book, and he wanted to finish reading it today, and tomorrow he would like to personally return it to Elizabeth. The young man did not want to give the book back for the simple reason that it was his only opportunity to contact Elizabeth. The girl reluctantly agreed to write to Elizabeth that Greg had found her book. Greg thanked her and went home to finish reading the book. In the evening, Mike called him and suggested they meet up, saying that he had some kind of trouble and needed a friend's advice. Greg immediately put down his book and started getting ready to meet his friend. Greg was very sleepy. He hadn't slept for more than a day. On his way to the pub where he was supposed to meet Mike, he had a lot of thoughts in his head. Greg noticed that he had lost track of time. He couldn't remember exactly how he got to the pub, whether he walked or took a taxi. He had a vague feeling that he was in some kind of dream, waking up only moments at a time. Greg walked into the pub, and Mike immediately noticed him and walked over. Mike looked very concerned, invited Greg to sit down, and asked, "How are you doing? Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's great." What happened? Greg wondered. Mike looked at his friend with a searching and sympathetic look, as if he wanted to tell him something that could hurt him deeply but hesitated to do so. "Greg, listen," Mike began again. "You've been acting strange lately and we're worried about you." "Strange," Greg smiled. "Yeah, strange. You're obsessed with that girl. You've been searching for her all over campus today. I told you to stay away from her." "I don't understand," Greg replied. "Why are you all against her?" What did she do to you that you all hate her? Mike put his head down on the table and didn't hurry to answer. It seemed that something was bothering him, but he couldn't talk about it. Then he raised his head, looked at Greg with a caring look, and asked, "Aren't you tired of that book yet?" "No, on the contrary. I've only read the first part and can't wait to read the rest." "All right, buddy. Let me walk you home. I was actually hoping to take a stroll anyways. We haven't been seeing much of each other lately," said Michael. "Sure, I'd be happy to," replied Greg. But deep down, he really wanted to be alone, so he could finish reading his book and think about what he was going to say to Elizabeth when he see her. On the way home, they talked about school and upcoming exams. Greg even forgot about his girlfriend for a while. Michael told him about a famous musician who was going to be at the piano exam and who had also been a student at their college. Greg was intrigued because he also dreamed of becoming a famous musician. Michael took Greg's phone and followed the musician on social media. When they got to Greg's house, Michael said goodbye and asked him to call if he needed anything. They were about to part ways when Greg remembered that Michael had not returned his phone. "Oh, right. We got so caught up in the conversation that I accidentally put your phone in my pocket and forgot to give it back to you," said Michael as he returned the phone. Greg went home, had dinner with his mom, and returned to his room. For some reason, he felt uneasy. It seemed like the world he was living in suddenly became empty. He felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Something was missing, something very important to him. He tried to remember what it was, but couldn't. Greg's gaze fell on Dante Alighieri's book, and he immediately remembered Elizabeth. At that moment, he felt a surge of strength and energy. He picked up the book and started reading it. He read a few dozen pages of the first part and unknowingly drifted off to sleep. A young man woke up to a notification on his phone. Greg picked up his phone and saw that it was 11 p.m. The message on the screen read, "Hey, this is Elizabeth. I heard you found my book. I think it would be better if you returned it to me. It means a lot to me." The message included an address where the girl lived. Greg immediately got out of bed, got dressed, and left the house quietly. Mark was very excited, and his mind was racing. He had a feeling that something big was about to happen. His whole body was shaking, and sweat was pouring down his forehead. He caught the first taxi he saw and asked the driver to take him to the address mentioned in the message. On the way, Greg tried to think of what to talk about with Elizabeth. Maybe they could discuss Dante's Divine Comedy. He quickly took the book out of his pocket and began reading it from the first page. That's when he noticed that there were many bookmarks and underlined verses in the book. Greg didn't remember seeing them before. He was struck by the fact that the highlighted verses had a greater impact on him. Elizabeth must have the same taste as me, he thought to himself. As he approached the destination, Greg realized that he had no money to pay for the taxi. It was strange that he hadn't thought about it before. After all, it was obvious that he would have to pay the driver somehow. In his haste, he forgot to take money with him. He explained to the taxi driver that he had forgotten his wallet with money and that he would pay him back tomorrow. The taxi driver looked at the young man in the back seat and said, "Don't worry about it. Things happen." Greg was surprised that the taxi driver let him go so easily. There was compassion in his eyes, and the taxi driver wasn't even surprised when the young man told him he didn't have any money. He got out of the car and found himself in front of a small house that looked abandoned from the outside. He turned around and looked at the taxi driver, meeting his gaze again. Strange, Greg thought to himself. The taxi driver stood still and watched him as he walked towards the yard of the house, where there were old rusty swings. The wooden threshold of the house had long since rotted away, and the door was slightly ajar. Greg thought he had the wrong address and wanted to check Elizabeth's message again, but he couldn't find that message on his phone that brought him here. Still, he decided to enter the house. Once inside, the young man noticed the peeling walls and old furniture that was beginning to fall apart. From the stairs leading to the second floor, there was some light visible. Greg couldn't remember how he climbed the stairs. He just suddenly found himself in a small room where there was only one small lamp, shining dim yellow light. This room was well renovated, unlike the rest of the house. Greg walked into the room and looked around. He had a feeling that Elizabeth would come in any moment. He sat down next to the lamp and started to wait for her, but she didn't show up. Gradually, he began to realize the strangeness of the situation. The house he found himself in seemed abandoned, and he was uneasy with the sound of creaking boards and the wind that was blowing through the house. Suddenly, he was overcome with fear. But then Elizabeth entered the room and Greg was startled by her appearance. She didn't make a sound. Not even her steps were audible. She just sat next to Greg and looked at him. He didn't say anything either, as he felt that his words might frighten her away. They sat there, gazing into each other's eyes for several hours. Then, Greg unexpectedly heard Male's voice calling him. His friend was climbing up the stairs, calling his name, but Greg didn't respond. Michael was searching every room, and Greg's only thought was that he hoped they wouldn't be found. He felt that if strangers entered the room, Elizabeth would disappear. Finally, Michael found Greg. He was standing over him, trying to bring him back to his senses, but Greg was still staring at Elizabeth. Michael was saying something to him and shaking him by the shoulder, trying to get him to stand up, but he didn't respond. "Greg, snap out of it. Let's get out of here," Michael shouted. Finally, Greg felt as though he had woken up from a dream. Elizabeth was gone, and his entire world had become dull again. "Why did you come here? You scared her off," said Greg, enchanted. "Dude, I've been trying to tell you. There's no girl named Elizabeth. You made her up. You have episodes where you start seeing things that aren't real," explained his friend. "I don't believe you," whispered Greg. "You've been reading this book for years and never make it past the first part because you forget that you've read it. You're sick and you need help," his friend continued. Greg's mind refused to believe these words. His whole world collapsed, and he felt mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt incredibly sad. On the other hand, he was plagued by doubts. They took the young man home. He couldn't come to terms with the harsh reality, and from time to time, he went in search of his Elizabeth. Greg was really sick. All the teachers and students in college knew this, and that's why everyone treated him well. Michael, being his closest friend, looked after him. Elizabeth was just a figment of Greg's imagination,